Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar. This webinar is sponsored by NIMBioS, the National Institute for Mathematics and Biological Synthesis. And our institute is sponsored by the National Science Foundation here at the University of Tennessee. And today we're going to hear Lou Gross talk about modeling for a globally connected world, what models are good for and how they work. I'm your moderator today. I am Suzanne Lenhart. I'm the Associate Director for Education and Outreach out here at NIMBioS, and I'm also a Professor of Mathematics. I want to remind you today how we're going to interact with this screen, especially with the questions. So if you see down at the bottom of your screen, we're going to have a way for you to submit questions. And then also, so you can just type in your question. Also, later you can, as it goes on, you can vote you can vote like a thumbs up or a thumbs down for a question. So if you like a question, it might get pushed up to the top, and so you can do that. I also want to mention that we are not monitoring the chat. So if you have a question, you should put it over in the questions. I would like to also remind you that at NIMBioS, we're going to have a webinar this time next week, and it's going to be given by Vitaly Ganusov. And he's going to talk to you about mathematical modeling of malaria transmission by mosquitoes. I also want to remind you that there will be a recording of this webinar, and it will be posted in a couple of days if you need to see it. So I want to introduce our presenter. So Lou Gross is our Phyllis Leader and Director of NIMBioS. He's a Chancellor's Professor and the Beeman Distinguished Professor in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and of Mathematics. He is well known for his research in mathematical ecology and for his work in educational research and training life science students. He's also the director of the Institute for Environmental Modeling. So Lou, take it away. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. I very much appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate everyone who's listening in today. Before I start on the objectives for today, I wanted to point out that this series was in part engendered by the fact that this is a very unusual time. Unusual in the sense that the pandemic has driven many of us to be working from home and to isolate ourselves from others, but also unique in that this is the first time in my lifetime in which there has been a very significant media presence with a discussion of models and modeling. And in my experience, relatively few people have ever understood or seen what a model is scientifically. So we have an obligation as scientists, and many of you who are on this are modelers, to be able to express to the general public what models are about, what their limitations are, and how they can benefit us in society. So it's a unique opportunity for us to share our own expertise with others. So this webinar series was brought about to both encourage a general audience to understand some of the aspects of models and modeling in the scientific process that connects quantitative methods to the life sciences, but at the same time, for those who are already heavily involved and are themselves doing research in this area or are teaching in this area, to hopefully allow you to see some alternative perspectives on how to explain models to others. So my objective today is not to aim this at those who already know a phenomenal amount about modeling. Hopefully you'll see something in here that you might find useful in explaining models to others. Rather, this is a pretty general approach to what models are about and some of the processes that are involved in modeling. So the overall objectives are first to provide an overview of what modeling is and the process of it and what the objectives of the modeling process is, to describe a few different types of models and their applications, and to focus a bit on the limitations of models and how we evaluate them. That's the overall goal. Now, today we are faced with many, many different kinds of models in the media. I thought I would highlight at the beginning of this some that have just arisen in the last few weeks. So those that were on this webinar 2 weeks ago heard Nina Pfefferman. Nina's our distinguished colleague here at the University of Tennessee in ecology and evolutionary biology and mathematics as well. Nina has published this along with several co-authors, including Aziz Yakupo, who's a great friend of us here at NIMBioS. This is a preprint published on medRxiv, and this particular model uses what Nina described in her webinar as an SIR model, meaning a model that tracks groups of individuals in the settings of either they are susceptible, infected, or removed or recovered from the population. And what's different about this particular paper is that that model is modified to account for the fact that testing is going on, and testing leads to a set of observational data that may or may not be completely accurate due to the sensitivity of surveillance and a variety of clinical testing errors. So Nina and her colleagues have modified this model to account for some of the realistic aspects of testing today and what the implications of that are. As a completely different type of model, Lydia Baruba, who is a member of the advisory board for NIMBioS and has been a wonderful friend to us, has just published this in the Journal of the American Medical Association Insights. And this relies on her work, which is in fluid dynamics, and particularly biological fluid dynamics, in which Lydia has data, and on the lower right of the screen, you'll see a sneeze and the associated spread of particles from a sneeze. Lydia has used data such as that to link to mathematical analysis of models in fluid dynamics, and you may have seen some of the recent press about her results that sometimes say under certain circumstances 6 feet is not sufficient to completely isolate yourself from particles moving in the air. As another example, Lauren Anselmeyers has produced this paper that is up with a couple of colleagues that deals with probability and maps of the US. And I bring this up for a couple reasons. First of all, Lauren is a wonderful researcher who has done a phenomenal amount of work at connecting ecological ideas to epidemiological ideas. But on the upper right here, you see a figure of the US that's a map. And there are several different kinds of ways to produce a map. It could just be a map that indicates the data. And many of the maps that you see in the press today are maps that essentially illustrate the spatial aspect of data on numbers of infected or numbers who have recovered or other measures of the particular pandemic that's underway now. But this particular map actually derives, in this case, from a different kind of model that Lauren and her colleagues have used. It's called a branching process model. What a branching process is a mathematical way of describing how one person might infect one other person, or two, or three, or four, or more. And so in the little figure that's here, this particular individual can be seen as infecting or leading to infections in 7 other individuals, whereas this one leads to an infection in 1 other individual. So the notion of a branching process is that not every individual is the same, and that there's a certain probability distribution, meaning that you can't necessarily tell in advance how many infections will arise from a particular individual. And that branching process model was used by Lauren and her colleagues in producing the probability of an epidemic starting in different counties across the US. So those are three examples of different ways that models arise, particularly in analyzing the current pandemic. And there are many, many others. If you take a look at medRxiv or bioRxiv, you'll find that there are hosts of different modeling papers being produced by groups all over the world. Now, this is not something that is new to us here at NIMBioS. We were established as a center in part to deal with zoonotic infections, those diseases that are infectious and arise in part due to transmission from another organism, and then may spread either due to that other organism or due to infections that cross between two humans. I bring this up just because we have had a whole series of working groups and workshops that deal with various aspects of infectious disease analysis. And if you go to the NIMBioS website, you'll find that there's a great deal of detail about how these diseases have been modeled, and they use a wide variety of different forms. Some of them are closely connected to human behavior. Others are connected to the behavior of hosts. And I encourage you to take a look at some of those if you're interested in learning more about the wide range of diseases that are not current coronavirus that have been analyzed over a long time and with many important results that have influenced policy. So the overview of what I'd like to do today is to talk a bit about science and models, say something about the alternative methods to investigate them and theory and some of the constraints on models, and then a bit about how models are evaluated. At the end, I'll wind up with a few lessons from this experience. So please, as I go through it, please feel free to send along your questions in the box, and I'll get to them at the end. So this is my favorite quote about what is science. I will read it. Science is thought to be a process of pure reductionism, taking the meaning out of mystery, explaining everything away, concentrating all our attention on measuring things and counting them up. It is not like this at all. The scientific method is guesswork, the making up of stories. The difference between this and other imaginative works of the human mind is that science is then obliged to find out whether the guesses are correct, the stories true. Curiosity drives the enterprise and the open acknowledgement of ignorance. So this is from an article by Lewis Thomas, published in an unusual place, the Sierra Club Bulletin, in 1982. I have read many of Lewis Thomas's other works. He's very well known for having written a host of books, including Lives of the Cell, The Medusa and the Snail, which were collections of his articles that were published in medical journals. I've never found anything that quite is as concise and well described in terms of what science is all about as this one. Now, there's two main points in this. One is that the scientific method is guesswork and the making up of stories. Those stories in science are models. Those models come together to create theories, more general collections of ideas, but models are the stories that we tell in science. But that's not enough. Science also has to determine whether or not the guesses that we make in these stories are indeed correct, and that involves data and observation. So science closely involves this connection between models and data. There's a wide variety of different ways to express theory verbally. So for example, the theory of evolution by natural selection. If you read The Origin of the Species by Charles Darwin, you won't find anything aside from verbal arguments in them. And yet that theory has had tremendous impact on our understanding of how the world works, including understanding the evolution of viruses. Theory can also be expressed graphically. It can be expressed mathematically. It could be expressed through simulation. And there are a number of different approaches that might be used to develop theory. Here's a few. It could be descriptive, meaning you're looking at a collection of data, and then you're using a theory to basically describe that data. Or it could be comparative in the sense of comparing two different viruses with different etiologies, different ways that they spread. And so that's a way of sort of developing theory, is by looking at comparisons between different systems with somewhat similar characteristics, but different ones. Theory can also be developed from mechanistic understanding. One typical way of doing that is breaking a system up into pieces and looking at how those pieces interact, usually expressed through a collection of equations of some sort that connect them. Or it could be mechanistic in the sense that it assumes that there's some overlying organizing principle that in some sense is optimizing or maximizing something relative to a set of constraints. That's the adaptationist program in much of biology takes that perspective. Another approach is to think of these as systems. So there's a whole body of work called general systems theory, which breaks a particular problem up into lots of pieces, analyzes them based upon the hierarchy of interactions, which often involves looking at the scales at which those pieces interact or don't interact. An alternative approach to develop theory is to think of the components, the individuals that make up a particular system. This is often called agent-based modeling or individual-based modeling. So for example, if you wanted to understand the spread of a disease, you can track individuals in the population and track whether or not they're in different disease states and how they spread by contact between individuals. So the National Institutes of Health have funded over a long time a program called the MIDAS program that takes this perspective towards infectious disease. Another alternative approach is expert systems, in which there's some sort of set of data and a collection of experts, or some machine learning algorithm that is used to analyze that data and taking a data-driven discovery approach to developing a theory arising from it. If you're interested, the National Academies in the US has a whole collection of wonderful reports. One of them that came out about a decade ago is the role of theory in advancing 21st century biology. And I encourage you, if you're interested in biology and quantitative approaches, that you might find that useful to look at to get a broad overview. Now, the stories in science are models, okay? But a model is really just a simplification of reality. I like to think of it as a map. It really includes some features that represent what we observe, but not others. So the process of modeling is the process of selective ignorance. We select what to include and what to ignore in our model. So this is a map of the campus of the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, a part of the campus at any rate. And there's certain things that you can learn from this map. You can learn where buildings are, you can learn where roads are. But there are many things that you cannot learn from this map. You can't see necessarily where the underlying network for the internet is. You can't see in this where the sewer lines are. So if you're interested in repairing a water line, this map would not necessarily be very helpful to you. So it includes certain things, but not others. And alternatives to that particular map, you might take a look at something like this, which is a Google image from the same area. In there, is it any less of a simplification? It's useful for other things in which you can sort of see where green is. You can see the green of the field of the football field. But there's still many things that are missing. You can also see individual cars in this particular. So you can clearly tell how crowded a particular parking lot is at the time that this image was taken. So maps tell us certain things about how the world works. Models tell us certain things about how the world works. And I claim that you make models all the time. So right now, you're taking account of many factors, data from sources you trust, your personal beliefs on who to interact with, whether to leave your home, how often to do so. Now, that's a decision that you're making. You're not really likely taking a formal calculation of your personal risk of harm from the current pandemic, but an underlying model is certainly involved. You're taking into account certain factors to make a decision. And that decision you might be able to explain verbally to others, but you likely are not going to write down the mathematics for it or write it down quantitatively, although some of you may be. So you're deciding what's best for you arising in this case. And even in times in which we might consider more normal, then you're making models. So here's an example that you may be sort of thinking wishfully of being able to go back to this, but there are certain things about going into a store where there's lots of lines and you have to make a decision about what line to go in. That decision might be based upon looking and seeing how many people in each line have a certain amount of material in their shopping carts, or their buggies, as we say here in East Tennessee. And it might be based upon how rapid a checker is versus an express line versus a self-checkout. So those are decisions that you make regularly, and you're not necessarily making a mathematical model of it, although there are mathematical models for lines. It's part of queuing theory. So again, you're deciding what is best for you quite regularly in these kinds of a situation. Now, over many years, many biologists, if they're asked about what a model is, they think of this. They think of a model as an animal model, in the case of a rat or a mouse that's used to study physiology, or a squid to study neurobiology, or the zebrafish in development, or E. coli in microbiology, or the Drosophila for genetics, or some kind of other model such as an aquaria or a terrarium for understanding connections between various species in a model system. So those are all perfectly valid models. They have different objectives from the quantitative models I'm going to be mainly discussing, although the quantitative models also are used to analyze how effective these particular models are in analyzing any particular biological question. So there's a variety of ways to consider a taxonomy of models. It could be based on the objectives of the model, or on the approaches used, or the methods used. And one possibility is this breakdown where we consider a model as conceptual. Often that means some kind of graphical figure that includes the key components and what connects to what. Could be verbal, as I pointed out with regard to the origin of species. It can be quantitative. They could be physical, such as models for airplanes in wind tunnels, or similar sorts of things for animals to evaluate heat loading. Or they could be biological, such as the animal models on the previous slide. Now, if you take a look at textbooks on modeling, those are typically classifying models based upon their quantitative approach. But there are other ways of doing it. This is a slide to point out that there are many different reasons for considering constructing a model. So one thing that models can do is that they can suggest observations and experiments. So by looking at a model, you can say, yes, maybe we should make the following set of observations to assess whether or not this part of the model is appropriate or not. They can provide a framework to assemble bodies of facts. So it could be a way to sort of standardize data collection, to collect data together. Often statistical models are essentially ways of collecting all kinds of data and summarizing them in some way. A quote from Francois Jacob is, models allow us to imagine and explore a wide range of worlds than ours, giving new perceptions and questions about how our world came to be as it is. So it's a way of considering alternative universes. Models can also clarify hypotheses and chains of argument by being put in a very logical form that allows us to see what implies what. It can allow us to identify key components in systems. So the whole approach that's called parameter sensitivity analysis and uncertainty analysis are ways of looking at models to say this parameter modification or this component modification does or does not impact the main outputs that we care about. It allows us to identify key components in systems. So models often are aggregated in the sense that they include some components of a system and not others. In the classic epidemiological SIR model, in which we break down a group of individuals into susceptible, infected, or removed, we're ignoring the fact that every individual in there is different, that they could be different in age, they could be different in terms of the status of their infection, how long they've been infected. All of those affect the components of the system and therefore allow us to say whether or not we should aggregate or disaggregate. Models also allow us to consider at the same time spatial and temporal change. That's something that intuitively may be difficult to do, and models allow us to consider both at the same time. It can also allow us to extrapolate to broad spatial or long temporal scales for which we don't have data and for which we don't really have a good way of figuring out what will happen or what might happen without having a model there. Models can also prompt testable hypotheses, and this was a theme of David Talmey's webinar presentation last week, in which he basically argued that models are scientific hypotheses. So they're a way of expressing our hypotheses in a formal manner. They can serve as a crude guide to decision-making in circumstances where action can't wait for detailed studies. And this is going on right now. There are many kinds of models that are used to extrapolate beyond simple rules of the thumb for identifying what the impacts are of different kinds of social distancing, for example. Models can also provide an antidote to the helpless feeling that the world is too complex to understand in any generality. It provides a way for us to get at general patterns and trends. And finally here, I think this last one is how many people think about models as a way to predict how a system will behave under different management and then control the system to meet some objective. So often when models are used, they're used in that predictive sense, but that's only one of many possible model objectives. No one model can do everything. So models are designed with particular objectives in mind, and one way of thinking about those trade-offs in models is whether or not they are a model that is very general, a model that is precise, a model that is realistic. So this sort of trade-off between different ways that models can account for a real-world system in part arose from Richard Levins in a book that he did on fitness and evolution back in the late 1960s. I modified that to sort of do it in this triangular diagram in which there are models that are designed really for generality. They have a little bit of realism, they don't have much precision. And those are models for theory development. Much of the classic theory in epidemiology was designed for generality. And then there are models that are very precise. Often statistical models are there. They're often descriptive, and they have some level of realism, but they're often not very general. So you can't pick up a statistical model necessarily for one particular disease and say that that model will also be useful for a different disease. And then there are models that are highly realistic in the sense that they incorporate lots of things that can be observed. You can actually measure the variables in these models. And those are sometimes called system simulation models. They are fairly realistic. They may be a bit precise. They don't often have a lot of generality. So models have trade-offs, and they can't do everything. The modeling process itself is not unidirectional. In many respects, there's things that go back and forth. So this is my way of illustrating this using environmental modeling, and that's the South Florida in the little figure in the bottom, because I spent a number of years working on Everglades restoration systems. So this is in that context of thinking about data. Those data could be spatial data encoded in a geographic information system map. Could be weather data, road data, densities of particular species, other sorts of data. The models then could be one of many different types. In the Everglades Restoration Project, we created multi-models that link together very different kinds of models together. Those then can be simulated using a variety of different either coding platforms or just done in distributed or parallel. Then there's the process of evaluating and analyzing the model. I mentioned sensitivity and uncertainty analysis. There's ways to visualize and to use corroboration to assess whether or not a model is appropriate given an independent data set. And then the model might be applied if indeed the evaluation process shows that it's a useful one for the purpose for which you've constructed it, to guide management input, and in the case of the Everglades, it's water control. And it also then might be used to guide additional monitoring, additional observation, or test taking, for example, that then provides additional data. This overall view of modeling is circular, so it starts in one place and continues around, and there might be ways in which you jump from one model back to data before actually carrying out a full analysis, or providing any necessary input to management because the model is deemed not quite ready for prime time yet. There are a number of different ways to describe models. There's no single protocol to describe models. Some models are described graphically. So on the left-hand side here is a kind of conceptual map of a paper that we constructed that links a model for human behavior to a global climate model. The purpose of that little diagram is to point out the connections between the components, and those components then are interacting with certain others and only others. So the arrows don't go everywhere in this. They go from one component to another, indicating that there's a sequence of operations associated with this particular model in terms of how it's constructed. So that's one kind of graphical model. Often conceptual models are done in this format where they're basically box and arrow kinds of diagrams. On the right-hand side is a different kind of graphical model. It's a function. And here we're describing using three different alternative functions the way that perceived risk associated with extreme events, meaning extreme weather events, are affecting an individual's perception of how risky the situation is. This was applied to analyzing human behavior in response to climate change. The point here is that some models are just a graphical function, and a function can be a model. In fact, in many high school modeling classes, the models are essentially functions like these. Another way to describe models, of course, is mathematically. This is a simple one that we used. Suzanne was actually co-author on this paper to look at using a simple model to analyze whether or not we could apply optimal control methods to an agent-based or individual-based model. In this case, we were using a very simple two-species model to analyze interactions between two groups of organisms, and whether or not we could use a simplified model like this separate from an agent-based model to actually control the system. So the point here is that you can describe a model mathematically. You can also describe models through the code that simulates the system. On the left-hand side is a flow chart that was associated with that paper that the equations in the previous slide were. And that flow chart basically describes the contextual flow in the code for a part of that underlying model that we use for the agents in the system. On the right-hand side is the actual code for, in this case, a simple way of looking at ecological succession. And in this case, it's in R and taken from the website for a book that Suzanne and I wrote along with Erin Botine, one of our former graduate students. Another way to describe models is by statistical methodology used, the data associated with it, metadata. So in this case, this is a Markov chain description in the upper table there from a paper that a whole group of us published at the end of last year on independence in pathogens. And the statistical model is a Markov chain, and the data associated with that are in the lower table there. So all of these are ways of describing models. Although there's no single method to describe models, I would like to point out one that I think is very useful. This grew out of the agent-based modeling literature. It's called the ODD protocol. And although it was developed for agent-based modeling, I think it can be readily used in many other contexts. And I encourage people who are thinking about modeling and how to describe a model to at least look at it. So this was written by Volker Grimm and a group of colleagues in this review, and it is, I think, a very useful way of thinking about it. ODD stands for Overview, Design Concepts, and Details. And in this particular description, the elements are to start out with the purpose of the model, very clearly state what the entities are, the state variables, the scales of operation, provide an overview of the underlying processes and the timing at which those processes work, and then a whole collection of design concepts that may or may not apply to every model that you're developing, but some of them will. And then go on to talk about initialization, how the model gets started, what the inputs required are, and any kind of submodels. So I encourage, if you've not looked at this protocol for describing models and you're in the process of thinking about modeling, that you might want to take a look at this. It's a very useful sort of structured way of analyzing models. It's not the only one by far. There are many others, particularly for coding. There's all kinds of software protocols. There's a wide variety of constraints on model development, though. There's data constraints, and that the data may not be sufficient to appropriately specify a form in the model, what the relationships are, what's interacting with what. It may indeed force you to aggregate components. So in the case of an infectious disease, not considering all of the various groups of individuals who may be affected by a particular disease, but rather aggregating them together and just calling them humans. And it may not be sufficient to elaborate the criteria for evaluation of model performance either. So thinking about evaluation, you should think about what the data constraints are. There's also effort constraints. People are rushing right now to construct models and don't have a lot of time to do it. So there's limits on time that models have to be developed. And there's also pressure right now to produce results pretty quickly. And we should thank our many colleagues around the world who are rushing around trying to come up with ways to best inform both the general public and policymakers. There's also computational constraints. So although computers are fast, they still are not fast enough to solve every problem. And there's other constraints, including ethical ones or societal constraints in which you may or may not, maybe should not be using the models in a particular way. You hear an awful lot about that with the kinds of models that are derived now from artificial intelligence and machine learning methods, because the problem is the it could have garbage in, garbage out, in the sense that the data that are used to motivate those models may not be appropriate to apply those models to other groups. We've heard that many times with AI models. So given all this, the modeling process involves this evaluation of alternative approaches to assess what's most appropriate for the questions of concern. That's what I call selective ignorance. And just as public policy decisions often involve a balancing act between various alternatives, in order to basically take into account the varying degrees of and desires of different stakeholders, realism in modeling also involves a balancing act. Keeping the ultimate goal in mind, and I call realistic modeling the science of the actual rather than the science of the ideal. So as a mathematician, you may want to write down a whole set of very interesting and challenging linked sets of equations, but realistically, you may not ever be able to identify how those components in that really interact. And so there's this trade-off between doing something that's realistic and something that might be intellectually satisfying in other ways. Modeling can do all of that. Some terminology about model evaluation. So verification is a term that I think of as indeed indicating that a model is behaving as it's intended, meaning that the equations are correctly representing the assumptions you wanted them to represent. The equations are self-consistent and dimensionally correct. Often one of the first things that you check in a model is whether or not the dimensions match up. And that the analysis, any analysis that's going on is correct, the code is correct, there aren't any bugs. An alternative component of evaluation is what's often called calibration, which is sort of model tuning. It's specific to a given criteria for accuracy. It's fitting the model to data. In essence, pretty much all of the machine learning algorithms are essentially calibrating the weights in the neural nets or whatever is used within the machine learning algorithm. They're calibrated using a particular set of data, and they're essentially fitting to that. Corroboration is the notion that you have a completely separate set of data from that used to develop the model, and you use that to basically determine whether or not the model is useful in a completely different situation because you have a different data set. Validation is a term that I try not to use a great deal. It means that the model is in agreement with the real system it represents with respect to the purposes for which it was constructed. So that means that there's an implied notion of accuracy and domain of applicability. And unfortunately, the term valid is used for models quite a bit without accounting for the fact that that model was constructed with a particular range of potential applications and not others. So I try not to use that term validation. I prefer to use the more general term evaluation, which is that the model is appropriate to the objectives. It has utility, plausibility, might be elegant if you care about elegance. It might be simple. As Nina pointed out, there's some real benefits to very simple models in helping us understand somewhat more complicated situations. And also it's flexible. So those are various components of evaluation. Again, for these, there's no one single way to carry out evaluation. And remember that the overall purpose of modeling is to provide insight into the system that you're concerned about. So given that there are many different objectives for models, we should really expect that there might be different criteria as well for evaluating whether a model is useful. So that I would argue that before developing a model in any detail, it would be helpful to develop criteria to establish how it will be evaluated, okay, relative to the purpose for constructing the model. So these evaluation procedures should account for the constraints of data, effort, and computation. And the evaluation criteria should be taken into consideration in assessing these methods, the level of detail, the scale of the model, and what to ignore, okay? So that there's this back and forth between evaluation criteria and models. So in evaluating different types of models, in general models for theory development, the evaluation is often qualitative. It's not explicitly calibrating or corroborating the underlying model. These are models that are produced for general theoretical approach, but it might be that you want to do theoretical corroboration, meaning that the model agrees with a general body of theory in the field. And that's because these models that are designed for theory development are not designed with necessarily a lot of realism and precision in mind. However, there are descriptive models that are often statistical models. They don't have to be. And those descriptive models tend to be fairly precise, but they're not necessarily very general. And there's a whole field of statistical hypothesis testing and statistical analysis that is used if the model is a statistical one to analyze them. Certain other descriptive models, such as machine learning ones, also can be very precise. How general they are is still up in the air. It depends on the particular methods used and the input to it. And there, it's not as clear what the appropriate evaluation criteria are. Again, it's dependent upon what the underlying objective are. So typically, there is some kind of a test data set that is used to describe them, and then that test data set is then compared to an alternative target data set to evaluate whether or not it's useful. So that's corroboration for those machine learning. And then there's models for very specific systems that might be very realistic. So for a particular crop in a particular location, what the yield will be in certain weather conditions. And there you can do pretty careful quantitative comparisons constrained by the available data. If the model has lots of components, you can also do component by component assessment of whether or not the components are realistically taking into account the observations and data. As a very specific example of model evaluation, the global climate modeling community has thought a great deal about how to compare the simulations from the wide range of different global climate models that have been developed. So the objective of this CMIP-5, this is the fifth one, coupled model and a comparison project, is to evaluate how realistic the models are in simulating the recent past and comparing and contrasting these alternative global climate models, which have sometimes millions of variables inside of them, provide projections of future climate change on the near term and on the long term, and compare the models in terms of those projections, and try to understand why one model might have a different projection from another, and to understand those factors that are responsible for differences, okay? And then this can devolve into analyzing particular components of these very complicated models. Just as an example, so this is let's just consider the upper right graph there, which is projections under different, what are called representative carbon pathways of groups of different models. And you can see that the colors here correspond to groups of different models. There's 32 to 39 models and different ones of these that are run. And you can see that those models produce somewhat different results. And yet the general trends are all very, very similar if you particularly look within any particular representative carbon pathway. But there are clearly differences between them. So this is a group of models that have gone through a very careful set of evaluations. So despite the importance of evaluation, if you read much of the literature, particularly in mathematical and quantitative biology, many papers published don't actually explicitly discuss evaluation criteria. And why is this? Well, first of all, evaluation is difficult. It requires potentially different skill sets from those used in constructing and using the models, often involving statistical analysis that the model developers may or may not have in themselves. So this is an argument for collaboration. Also, science is very much a human enterprise, and it's natural that once you've invested a considerable amount of effort in developing a particular model, it's difficult to critique yourself. And modern settings involve lots of teamwork, and that teamwork can involve lots of experimental protocols and can really constrain individuals who don't want to say, wait a minute, let's step back a minute and really assess whether or not this particular assumption makes sense. Obviously, we should value those individuals in science who take that critical eye perspective, but it's one reason why potentially there's not as much effort devoted to model evaluation as there might be. So I put this up because these are the criteria that I use in reviewing papers. So when some journal sends me a paper, these are the kinds of general questions I ask. I ask, are the models included appropriate to the biological questions being addressed? In other words, will they actually say something about the biology that's interesting, if this is a biological sciences journal? Are the underlying biological questions of potential interest to a significant fraction of the journal's audience? If the biological questions are straw dogs, then it's not necessarily going to be that interesting. Does the mathematics and the model teach us anything new that's biologically significant? Is the mathematics and modeling correct? That's always helpful. If the paper is strictly theoretical, does it point out broadly useful new insights? Are the model parameters and variables estimable from observations? And is there some effort in the paper to actual model evaluation? So those are the criteria that I use. Some take-home lessons from all of this is that, first of all, model evaluation for all types of biological models has been relatively rare, unfortunately. When I say all types here, I also mean sort of models, organisms. So whether or not a particular model organism, a mouse or a rat, appropriate to address a particular biological question is not necessarily carefully evaluated. There's a whole set of papers about that. It also is useful to set criteria for model evaluation prior to expending a lot of effort on any particular model, and to tie the evaluation criteria to model objectives. It's also useful to encourage consideration of evaluation, not just in modeling, but in your educational initiatives. The entire field of education research involves thinking about evaluating what you are doing in your formal classrooms, in your interactions with students of all types, and to say, is this really effective, or are there better ways? Are there alternative pedagogies to consider? And so I encourage you as well as thinking about whether or not you evaluate your science, think about how you evaluate your educational initiatives. Another point here is that multiple models are good. So the global climate community, I think, has benefited a great deal from having a whole set of groups all around the world who take somewhat different perspectives on what to include in these complicated models. Sometimes that leads to convergence in the sense that the models lead to similar kinds of behavior, not necessarily exactly quantitatively, but qualitatively. And so multiple models are good. It's often useful to have two different groups of individuals working on the same underlying problem. We're benefiting from that right now with regard to the current pandemic. There are groups all over the world that are bringing their expertise to bear. whenever you get asked to review a paper, if you are, please consider whether an evaluation has been done as you review that paper. So I want to thank you very much for your participation in this webinar. I'm happy to address questions, and I think Suzanne's going to take a look at the list of questions and move forward with what we have to pose to me. So Suzanne?
Thank you, Lou, for a very interesting talk and one which generated many questions. I think we have about 14 questions, 13, 14 questions. So I think I'm going to start at the ones at the top, and hopefully we can answer a few of these. So this first question is about near the beginning of the talk. Doesn't the spatial data of the US in Lauren Ansel-Meyer's paper simply replicate the population distribution in the US?
That's a very good question, okay? So that map, okay, was a map designed to account for the probability of an epidemic, okay? And an epidemic, and now remember, I'm not the author of this paper, but this is my reading of the paper. An epidemic means that, in this case, there will be local spread of the, in this case, coronavirus. And so even though the populations are very, very different in different places, the probability of development of a local epidemic is not a function necessarily of population size. But those who listen to Nina's talk know that indeed, the larger the pool of susceptibles are, the longer an epidemic may persist. And that was not the objective of that particular map. I would be great if Lauren were on to answer this particularly for that question. But that's a very good question. The map sort of looks like it is connected to population density. But my understanding of the way that the modeling was done was that it was not necessarily derived directly from population density.
I just wanted to say that judging from this last question, they were asking about, are the slides going to be posted? I think, yes, we will post the slides also, so you can get those later off the website, yes.
So we will post not only the slides and video of this, right, but also we will post the list of the questions and that were posed. And I will likely throw up a list of some underlying books on modeling that I think might be useful. So it's just sort of a set of references.
Okay. So one of the questions moved up higher, so I'll start with a different one. From a practical perspective, how to focus on or ignore elements when building models. Example, let's say I want to model the propagation of a disease after a first introduction in a country. What criterion should I use before starting on the construction of my model?
So first question is, what is the model being used for? Is it being used to inform policy on a short term? Is it being used to particularly consider alternative ways, for example, if there were a vaccine, how to utilize that vaccine effectively? So the first question is why you're constructing this model, right? And then the second question is what are the capabilities of the data that you have in order to actually construct a model that can be compared in any sense to actual data in this case? Or what's the potential for new data to arise? So both of those constrain it. There's two general approaches to thinking about modeling. Basically, there's what's called the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid. And that means that often starting with the simplest model you can think of might be the appropriate way to go. There are alternative perspectives, which is you throw everything in and you see what connects to what. If you're starting out with relatively little data in a system you know relatively little about, so in the case of the coronavirus, we knew very little about the etiology of this disease, and therefore starting with pretty simple models made a lot of sense. And those models are getting much more complicated now. They're accounting for economic, social processes and others. So I'm not sure if that completely answers the question, because the process of modeling is in some sense an art. It takes a lot of experience. Suzanne's done this an awful lot. She could also respond on this too.
Okay, well, here's a related question related to COVID. What's your take on the COVID-19, considering the poor and rich communities who may or may not be able to adhere to the only control measures in place due to economic constraints? What kind of models can we use to give useful insights?
That's a very, very important and great question. So we actually had a working group at NIMBioS that focused a lot of their attention on linking human behavior, and that behavior is going to be different for different social groups, as this questioner has pointed out, because there are constraints, economic constraints on that group. That working group was called the SPIDER Working Group, although it had nothing to do with spiders. That was an acronym. And I could go back in the slides, but I won't do that for now. And that group produced a whole set of papers that analyzed alternative economic conditions and how that impacted disease spread, as well as alternative ways of sort of considering human behavior and its responses. So that's a really important question. There has been a set of epidemiologists who've sort of taken that kind of an approach. I'm sure that some of those methods are being used right now in analyzing the COVID impacts. Okay, and it's not just that. So, in fact, Nina and I were talking about what might be called associated mortality that is not necessarily derived from the virus itself, but due to the fact that the virus is causing health systems to be highly constrained, reducing people's likelihood to going in, and particularly people who are under economic constraints due to loss of jobs. So this is a great example of the need for connecting biological modeling and social system modeling, something that we at NIMBioS have been fostering in part through the work of folks like Nina Pfefferman, who's done a lot of work on that, and in part through what we call DISOC, which is the Center for the Dynamics of Social Complexity, dysoc.org. And there, the focus of that is on linking notions of evolution and their impacts on culture and organizations, social organizations.
Okay, let's take this question that goes back a bit to the beginning of the talk.
Okay.
I like the Lewis Thomas quote, but I think that science is not obliged to find out which model is correct. No one can do that. Science is obliged to put the models in order from most to least likely, preferably with a probability attached to each.
Okay, there's a Bayesian perspective, okay, with updating. And that is a great way to think about this. And yes, so perhaps that quote shouldn't say correct, but should say something like that questioner posed as more likely than others, okay, or more consistent with the available data. That's the way I like to think of evaluating models, is how consistent they are to observation data and the general understanding of how the world works. In this case, that would be called theoretical corroboration. And as the sort of questioner sort of may have intended there, A Bayesian approach to modeling says that you update models based upon additional information, and then change your distribution of which model is correct based upon that additional information. That may or may not be across a whole collection of models. It may be within one model, and what components within that model are most appropriate to include or not.
Okay, here's one also sort of from the beginning of the talk. I enjoyed your map analogy for describing models. Do you have any other useful tips or analogies for describing models to laypersons and decision makers?
Yeah, so again, I use two. I use the map analogy as one, but also just thinking about daily decision making, okay? So another great example is thinking about someone who's driving a vehicle and wants to go from one place to another. How do they decide what way to go, all right? Now, of course, there's a whole body of transportation theory, and now you have your little cell phone that tells you where to go if you want to follow it. But you're making decisions there, and those decisions are decisions that are influenced by your own prior experience and your preference on that particular day. And so thinking about transportation is one way of sort of an alternative. I also like to think of a dartboard analogy for models too, that some models work very, very well in very limited circumstances. And so that's the inner ring in that dartboard. Other models are much more general, and that's the sort of the bigger hitting the dartboard at all, okay? So a dartboard might be another sort of metaphor for models that are designed for very specific purposes, whereas ones that are very general.
Okay, that seems good. All right, this is a moving target here because people are voting. It's a little bit. Okay, so yeah. Okay, let's see here. Okay, here's an interesting question. Is the real power of models that they often have the possibility of generating counterintuitive predictions?
So that is one certain objective of models. I wouldn't say an objective, it arises that sometimes you get a result that you just didn't intuit, and because of that, you've provided some novel insight into how the world works. And in biology, often that is called an emergent phenomena that arises from connecting many independent interacting entities. This is one of the main ideas of agent-based modeling, in that there are patterns that arise that emerge but are not really clearly encoded in the individual rules or behaviors of the entities that make up that system. Emergence is a key idea. In fact, it's one of the ones that is discussed in the ODD protocols, and is an example of a model providing, and that often happens in agent-based models. There are results that arise that you didn't necessarily anticipate based upon the underlying rules. Sometimes you can use this as a way to figuring out what of the particular rule structure of the model, or if it were not necessarily an agent-based model, if it were a mathematical model, what are the particular assumptions or functional forms in the model that lead to a particular kind of behavior. The whole field of bifurcation analysis in dynamical systems is devoted to trying to understand when there might be major changes in the observed phenomena, the outcome of a situation, when you change slightly some input or some component of the system. So the whole field of tipping points in which you get a sudden change so arose in the field of catastrophe theory and of course arose in what we typically would call chaotic dynamics, in which a small change in some component of the system can lead to unanticipated results. But just because that can arise doesn't mean that the model is not useful in situations in which you don't have some sort of bifurcation to a different set of states. It can still be useful otherwise.
Well, this is a related question somewhat. What has been useful to distinguish causation from correlation in your modeling?
Oh, this is a whole field of philosophy of science. And it's a great question. I guess we could have a whole course on causation and correlation. So obviously, to actually get at that in a model is not easy because you're building that model with a set of assumptions in it, and that set of assumptions may lead necessarily to one component impacting another component. And there are ways in models to analyze whether or not the outputs associated with a model are correlated. A host of statistical methods to analyze the correlation. And I'm here talking about stochastic models, okay, in which there is an actual statistical correlation function. I wish I could give a simple answer to the question of causality versus correlation, but there is a whole set of different definitions of causality that we could go into. Lorentz and others have a set of different notions of causality that I'd be happy if that person wants to send me an email. I could send them another whole talk on that, or a couple of papers that we've written about that.
Okay. We have a lot of here, Lou. So how long do you want to go on for this? I'm sorry to ask you that.
Well, why don't we go on for another 5 minutes or so?
Okay. Sounds fine. Okay, so let's try. Anyway, this is a comment for model evaluation. I think another issue is that many of the questions in a modeling study have already been thrown in it behind the scenes by a group when developing the model. How do you feel about that comment? So
I'm not sure that I quite get that. So in a group, yes, often people come in with, and we've had many working groups in which it takes time for the group to cohere in the sense of coming up with a particular model. And you and I, Suzanne, have been in many groups in which you start out with a whole collection of different models before you get down to one that you think is actually going to be useful for the question being posed. So I'm not quite sure if that's what the questioner is getting at there, but that of course means that the evaluation is people coming in and thinking about what the objectives for the model are quite different, and so the evaluation that might be thought of from the beginning might not be the same as what winds up at the end, because the group has sort of cohered on a particular approach.
Yeah. Well, here's a question. I wonder how models for COVID-19 were evaluated. Now that we are learning that many probably were quite wrong and overestimated the impact of the disease on mortality, how would you evaluate a model for which we have limited to no data?
Yeah, so the evaluation criteria for these models are whether or not they were useful in guiding public sentiment and policy. There, I think, that will be dependent upon the particular region, political entity, and so on. And whether or not the models are constructed in a way in which they are amenable to updating without going and throwing out everything. So flexibility of a model in the face of uncertainty, as the COVID-19 situation has been, is a good reason to say that the model is useful if it's sufficiently flexible to account for the changes as more data arise.
Okay, good point. Do you think about progression of models, thinking with one type and then moving on to a more complicated type as you learn more?
Yeah, that is a very common approach in science, is to have a general model that you then say, well, what happens if we do this? So, for example, I might as well use one of my students. Tyler Poppenweimer is a PhD student at the University of Tennessee in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and is interested in the question of what is happening below ground with roots in terms of their impact on plant growth. And many plant growth models basically just aggregate roots together. But roots are highly different. They have a variety of different age structure, just as the organisms above ground have different ages. And so what he's investigating is whether or not accounting for the different demographics below ground of roots greatly impacts the theories that we use to analyze plant performance. It's a mixture of models that are very simple to start with and then become more disaggregated as more aspects of different roots are taken into account. So there are certainly good reasons to consider disaggregating models, meaning taking account of the more detailed structure within them that is ignored in the first go-round, and seeing whether or not it matters. Okay.
Here's an interesting question just about adapting. How dynamic should the models be? For example, in a fast-moving pandemic, should the model itself be adapting as the situation changes?
Yeah, well, that, of course, I would argue that that's the whole Bayesian perspective. There's certainly a good reason to take that perspective in a situation like this, in which the policy implications from a particular model choice here are very large. They're large in terms of human lives impacted, as well as large in terms of economics. So it seems to me that having a set of models that are adaptive in the sense of being able to readily utilize new information as it becomes available and modify the suggested actions is important. Of course, in that process, people may not understand that this is part of the process of modeling, that as new information arises, the models change, just as science changes as new information arises about the details of the particular virus.
Okay, well, I think there's one more interesting point. Then there's a couple of people commenting about this. It's really about whether, is there a politician who will admit to following the models, and and then again, how do we help the general public and the decision makers, test the models and the data?
Yeah, so this is it's a great question about communicating science. And thankfully, there are people who are pros at this. And so we at NIMBioS have had the wonderful pleasure of having a full-time science communication expert who has now moved on, Catherine Crowley. And I learned a lot from her about how to effectively communicate science to both the general public as well as I will call it an educated lay audience as well. There's a whole field of science communications. I think there's a lot that we as scientists can learn from those who are experts on this. You don't have to take a whole course. You you can go and learn quite a lot by just reading some of the literature, and there are relatively simple rubrics to help you decide how to get across a particular idea to a general audience. And I encourage people, if they've not looked at that literature in science communications, to do so. The NIMBioS website has some information on this, and I encourage you to take a look at it.
Well, maybe we'll close here. I thank all the participants who sent many questions and that we didn't quite get to everybody's questions.
Okay.
And I really also want to thank Lou very much. Thanks.
And thank you, Suzanne. I appreciate you being here, and appreciate everybody for paying attention and listening. Thanks a lot.